Good morning, everyone. Today, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Mannion, who is the Director of Public Affairs for the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation. Needless to say, she's very knowledgeable about the Ellis Island Museum and especially the Statue of Liberty Museum, which the Old Guard has visited. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to figure out how to share my screen because I always think I know what I'm doing and then I don't know what I'm doing. So hi, thanks so much for having me. As Craig said, I'm with the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation. I joined the foundation probably about 5 or so years ago. Prior to that, I had been a consultant with the foundation as a communications person, and it really is an honor to work at the foundation. The Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation is the nonprofit that collaborates with the National Park Service in one of America's most successful public-private partnerships. The foundation has been around for 40 years. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan asked Lee Iacocca, who at the time was the head of the Chrysler Corporation and probably the country's most notable businessman at the time, to raise private funds for the centennial restorations of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. I'm going to show now a brief video that tells our history and an overview of some of the projects we've done, and many of you may be familiar with these projects and perhaps even supported them in your time. So hold on one moment while I get this going. We shall start again. This is Steve Briganti. He was CEO of the foundation for almost its entire history. He retired just a couple of years ago.
The Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation was started in 1982 when President Reagan asked Lee Iacocca, who was then the chairman of the Chrysler Corporation, to mount a private sector effort to restore both the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. The original goals were a bit vague. At the Statue of Liberty, it entailed actually restoring the statue, all of it, and Liberty Island. And we celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1986. And then we immediately went on to Ellis Island. Ellis Island is a much bigger place and needed a lot more work because it was really a ruin. When we got there were trees growing in the Great Hall. One of the things that everybody wanted to have done was the record center. They wanted the digitization of the manifest records. Well, that was easier said than done. We had to digitize about 500 million pieces of information. Then we went on to tell the story of immigration pre-Ellis Island and post-Ellis Island up to today. And of course, most recently, our greatest moment in many, many years is the opening of the Statue of Liberty Museum. So these projects would not have succeeded if it weren't for the American people. All the work we've done at both the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island has been done with private money. So really it's a tribute to the way people think about their country, about the symbols of their country. That's what the American people did for us.
So that gives you an overview of our organization. And now I can't figure out how to unshare this. Oh, here we go. Okay. So when our foundation did its fundraising, we really mirrored the approach that was taken in the 1880s. France had gifted the Statue of Liberty to the US, but America was responsible to cover the cost of her pedestal. And although barons of industry at the time, Vanderbilt, Astor, and the like, gave to the cause, it wasn't enough money. Here is the cover of a Life magazine from 1884, pointing out that we should all be embarrassed for not doing our end of the bargain, if you will. So Joseph Pulitzer stepped in. He was a publisher of the newspaper The World, and Pulitzer offered to print the name of every person who gave to the pedestal campaign. So the approach worked wonders. Pennies came in, larger amounts, people from all over the country gave, and this effort raised $100,000 in just 6 months. And of course, Pulitzer also sold a lot of papers because people wanted to see their name in print. So he wasn't a fool in terms of his little effort there. And Pulitzer is credited with having created the concept of crowdfunding, where you gave money for the pedestal and your perk, if you will, was having your name in the newspaper. So it wasn't a surprise to us in the 80s that the American people, and in fact, people from around the world, contributed to the restoration campaigns for both the statue and Ellis. And that tradition has continued for 40 years with individuals, foundations, and the like donating some $800 million to support the foundation's mission of preserving the monuments and telling their stories. And as Steve mentioned in the video, per Ronald Reagan's guidance to Lee Iacocca, donations came from the private sector. The foundations never used government funds for restoration and preservation projects. So indeed, these are beloved and cherished monuments. The foundation's first major initiative was restoring the Statue of Liberty. She was coming upon her 100th birthday, and it's not as though she was going to fall down, but certainly living on the Hudson River for a century had taken its toll. So the project began with wrapping the statue in scaffolding. The scaffolding was freestanding. It couldn't actually touch the structure. And at the time, this was the largest freestanding scaffolding in the world. A workshop was actually created right there on Liberty Island, where the craftsmen did their work. Artisans from France came in to work side by side with US craftsmen to do the work. Major components of the restoration included replacing about 200 armature bars, and those are like her bone structure, and then the copper being her skin, and that the armature bars keep the copper in place. And then part of her nose had to be replaced. There was a hole in it. A curl had to be replaced, and you see here an image of the rays of her crown being taken care of. Each was actually removed and cleaned up and then replaced. It turns out that one of the rays had been installed incorrectly in the 1800s and had been touching the statue's arm. So that was just one of the things that they found. But given the fact that this was originally constructed in the 1880s, it's really quite impressive. A major undertaking, and probably the most obvious to the public, was replacing the statue's original torch. The torch over the years had been altered with windows cut into the flame, and that was in an effort to make the statue a lighthouse. Unfortunately, that effort failed. She never really shone brightly with lights inside the flame, but it did succeed in letting in the elements, and that damaged the original torch beyond repair. So a new one was created and put up on the statue during construction in 1984. Then the Centennial Restoration culminated with a 4-day celebration in New York Harbor, Liberty Weekend. The statue's actual birthday, when she was dedicated, is October the 28th. It was 1886. But the celebration was held over 4th of July weekend, and that being one of the reasons France gifted the statue to America was to celebrate our country's own centennial. And they didn't make 1876, it was 10 years past, but it was quite the undertaking. But therein lies what was celebrated over that 4-day weekend. Included concerts, fireworks, tall ships in the harbor, President and Nancy Reagan speaking. The president of France was in town, so it was quite the undertaking. I'm told that it broadcast all over the world, and some 80 billion people saw it. That seems like a lot, but maybe that's the number I remember. So before we move on to Ellis Island, I want to share a bit about the Statue of Liberty Museum. This museum opened in May of 2019. Previously, the Statue Museum was located in the statue's pedestal, but after September 11th, the National Park Service restricted the number of people who could go into the statue. For those of you who visited before 9/11, you will recall that as many people as possible got in the statue every day. You would queue up on a very long line, and all 300 plus steps it took to get up to her crown, there was a person on every step, and that is no longer the case. About 4.3 million people visit Liberty Island every year, and with the post 9/11 restrictions, only about 7% of people can actually get up to the crown, and 20% are able to get into the pedestal. As such, that left most visitors unable to go inside and learn about the statue in that existing museum. So, of course, that inspired creation of the new museum. There are 3 galleries in the Statue of Liberty Museum. They tell the story of the statue's history, why she was created, what inspired the sculptor Bartholdi and the Frenchman Laboulaye to undertake this. The Engagement Gallery features artifacts, replica of Bartholdi's workshop, and demonstrates the repoussé method of hammering the copper to form itself into the structure around those armature bars I had mentioned. The Inspiration Gallery includes this replica of the statue's face that allows people to get a sense of the scope of the size. It's an exact replica that was created in the 80s when that workshop was on the island. And there is the original torch, which after it was removed from the statue, had lived inside the statue's pedestal. And then in 2018, as the construction of this museum was happening, we brought the original torch and flame over to the new museum. The Immersive Theater is actually the first experience you have when you walk in the museum. It's a 3-part, 9-minute film. It's really a primer of the statue's history and relevance. And before we proceed to talk about other things, I'd like to take a few minutes to share some footage from the Immersive Theater. And I find the visuals to be quite stunning. I hope it inspires some of you to visit the museum. As you can imagine, you're seeing it on a smaller screen, and if you were to see it on a very large screen, the visuals are pretty amazing. There isn't any sound. When you see the film in the museum, Diane Sawyer narrates it. She's talking about when it was dedicated and how Bartholdi designed it so people could actually just walk right into and climb the stairs to go up to her crown. These are the stairs. It's double helix, and the bars you see along the copper are those armature bars that I mentioned. Those were all but 4 of them were replaced during the restoration. And it's a pretty cramped space when you get up to her crown, but there is the visual of what it looks like when you leave the statue's crown. And then let me see what I have next here. This clip shows some of the contradictions that are part of the statue's symbols. One of the things the statue was meant to celebrate was the emancipation of slaves here in the US. But of course, oppression remained. And this part of the film references that. It references these chains and shackles at her feet that are broken, but yet oppression of Black people remained. The tablet talks about the anniversary of our founding and about freedom and liberty for all, but yet half the population still did not have the right to vote. And then the final visual I'd like to share with you all is just, this is how the film closes. And it really is just some dramatic images of the harbor and the statue. This is at sunset. A group came out and the filmmakers came out, and I think they spent 2, maybe 3 nights on Liberty Island shooting. This is drone footage and helicopter footage. This took a while for the National Park Service to approve this, but it brings us images that are so rare, and we are very lucky to have them featured in the museum. And just seeing the detail of the statue itself, being reminded that this is a work of art. It's not just a symbol. It's someone put this together, and she comes in 300 plus pieces, but this was created by a sculptor, and she is a work of art. And it's I think important to remember that and the detail with which she is presented. So I hope that has inspired some of you to come on out to the museum. And now we are on to Ellis Island and the National Museum of Immigration and the Immigrant Experience. Most of you are probably aware that Liberty and Ellis Islands, where they're located here in New York Harbor, they are 2 different islands. I am really surprised that many people aren't aware of that. They don't realize it. Regularly people say, is the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island? No, they have their own islands, each of them. So this is the layout of the island as it is today. The museum is located on the north side. The south side is also open to the public, some of the buildings. That is where the hospital was, the quarantine area. Much of that area is not restored, but hard hat tours are available, and I recommend that as well. It's cool and creepy all at the same time when you visit that side of the island. In the museum, there are 3 floors, and when the museum opened in 1990, the focus was on the Ellis Island experience alone, but the content was expanded, as Steve mentioned in that video I showed earlier. The content was expanded about 10 years ago to address trends and experiences before and after the Ellis era. These galleries are located on the first floor. Peopling of America talks about pre-Ellis, like through colonial days up until the 1800s. And the area called Journeys is post-World War II up till today. And what you find as you're looking at the different exhibits is, whether it was the 1500s or the 1900s, there are many similarities regarding why people left their home to come here and the experiences they had upon arrival. Of course, relevant and relative to the time that they traveled, but a lot of consistencies. To learn about the island's history, there is an exhibit called Ellis Island Chronicles on the 3rd floor. The Dutch referred to the island as one of 3 oyster islands in New York Harbor. The federal government took control of the area in 1808. A fort was built for the War of 1812, but it was never attacked. And at the time, the land was just 3.3 acres. When this island was selected to be the place for the immigration station, additional islands were created using landfill excavated from the New York City subway system, that construction process. 2 more islands were created for the hospital I mentioned, the quarantine area. It's where the doctors lived. And eventually more landfill was put in so that it would become 1 island. That's about 27 acres at this point. So also located on the 3rd floor are the galleries Silent Voices and Restoring a Landmark. Silent Voices discusses Ellis Island after it was abandoned by the US government in 1954. After 1924, when immigrant quotas and the visa system began, that limited the number of people who could come to the US, and therefore fewer and fewer immigrants were processed through Ellis Island. This, coupled with the fact that more people were arriving via airplane, Ellis was deemed excess surplus and shuttered. The government considered selling the land, but there was public outcry, I'm happy to say, because of its historical significance. And in the 1960s, President Johnson declared Ellis Island a national monument, which saved the structures. The foundation began the restoration project of Ellis while it was still working on the Liberty restoration. It was 1985. Another thing Steve Briganti mentioned earlier is that there were trees growing in the Great Hall and so much damage. Many of the island, when it was abandoned and before the government took over, people went there and scavenged. They took the copper, they broke things. So the place was a mess. And the first 18 months were spent just blowing hot air into the building to dry it out, because so many broken windows had allowed the elements to come in over the years, and there was a great deal of damage. So the next few slides are just the different areas of the building and when it was under repair. This is the Great Hall, also known as the Registry Room. That was all the scaffolding that took place in there. It was quite the undertaking to redo this room, and it really is quite majestic now. And here follows one of my favorite photos. This is from the Great Hall. Through those beautiful windows, you can see the statue, and I find that holds great meaning for the relation between the two, because the statue wasn't actually created. Her symbols weren't meant to represent immigration. In fact, Ellis Island was not created until a number of years after the statue was put up. She was created to recognize, as I mentioned, the end of slavery, the 100th anniversary of America, the history between France and America, and our democracy, because politically things were changing in France at the time. So those were the things that inspired France to gift the statue to the US. And then Emma Lazarus' poem that talks about "Give me your huddled masses," that wasn't relating to the immigration experience per se. She was a supporter of immigrants coming here, especially through Jewish Aid Society. But Emma wrote the poem as part of the fundraising campaign to raise money for the statue's pedestal. So the restoration itself was completed in 1990. That was 2 years before the Ellis Island centennial. And that is when the Ellis Island Museum of Immigration opened. It was almost to the day. It will be, the anniversary is next week, September the 9th is the day that the museum opened. Now I'd like to tell you a bit about how the Ellis Island immigrant experience is depicted in the museum and spotlight some of the exhibits. Prior to 1892, the states were responsible for processing immigrant arrivals. Each state made its own rules. I learned actually just yesterday from a park ranger, for example, I believe it was 1809, the federal law was changed to prohibit people being brought over here as enslaved people, yet each state handled its own manifest system, so it was still happening in some places, and that, among some other reasons, are why the federal government took it over. So Castle Garden is right here, and in the Battery, which is on the right-hand side, just under Trinity Church and the Charging Bull. You can see the Battery, and that's where Castle Clinton is known today, previously known as Castle Garden. This is where today you get your tickets to go on the ferry to visit Liberty and Ellis Islands. So in addition to what I was just saying about the states breaking the law, and the government not able to maintain the laws of bringing in enslaved people, for example, as well as the mistreatment of immigrants, because they were right there. Castle Garden was right there in Lower Manhattan. So con men would come and swindle them out of money and lie to them with false claims of being able to help them. So that issue, along with just the sheer number of immigrants that was increasing, the federal government chose to take over the immigration process and formalize the whole system. And of course, they needed a facility that could manage the increased number and to manage all of the staff that had to be dealing with that. The original Ellis building was made of wood. It burned down in just 5 years after it was opened. It opened originally in 1892 and burned down in 1897. And along with it, the ship manifests that documented immigrant arrivals. That will be relevant in a little while when I talk about family history. The structure that we see today was reopened in 1900. In the years when it was being rebuilt, the process was moved back to Castle Garden, and that's where the paperwork was done there and the people were processed. So Ellis Island, as I mentioned before, it was the nation's first federal immigration station. It opened in 1892 and was really the peak years led until 1924. And as many as 70% of all immigrants who came to the US during that period came through Ellis Island. Of course, there was Philadelphia, someone mentioned Boston, there was Angel Island on the West Coast, but Ellis Island was the primary place for immigrants to come through. After World War II, the fear of outsiders swelled and the door to America really began to swing shut. The Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 limited immigration to just 165,000 people a year. And the ratios of the nationalities for those numbers were based on immigrants who came through in 1892. So that is, if 3% of immigrants who arrived in 1892 were German, only 3% of new immigrants could come through after this act was passed. Not surprisingly, this certainly favored Northern Europeans, mostly white people, and it made it particularly difficult for Eastern and Southern Europeans to come to America. This is a list of the countries, nationalities of most Ellis Island immigrants. It's alphabetical, not by number. These photos are actual immigrants. They were taken by a gentleman called Augustus Sherman. Sherman was a clerk at Ellis Island from 1892 through 1925, and he took about 250 photos of immigrants who were dressed in their traditional clothing. These were usually people who were detained at Ellis, and his photos are featured throughout the museum and also searchable online. It took up to a month to sail to Ellis Island. Most immigrants traveled via steerage class. This was located in the lowest level of the ship, and only imagine being down there cramped with 2,000 other people. You're next to the boiler and the engines. There's poor ventilation. People are getting seasick. I think it took a great deal of courage for people to take this journey. I have amazing admiration for them. When the ships came up through the Narrows under what is now the Verrazano Bridge, they would dock there in New York Harbor. First and second class passengers were inspected on the ship, but passengers who sailed in steerage, as I mentioned, most immigrants did this because it was the least expensive, they were ferried to Ellis Island for inspection. The ferries docked right here where today's ferries, where the visitor ferries are right now, right where it says museum entrance, and they made their way in for the processing process. The first immigrants came through on January the 1st, 1892. Annie Moore, a teenager from Ireland, was the first person to be processed through Ellis Island. I am told by some reliable sources with the National Park Service that Annie indeed was not the first person online, but they moved some people around so that they could have this young, fresh-faced girl to represent the first immigrant. And if I remember correctly, Annie and her brothers each got silver coins or something to commemorate it. I'm going to show a video now. This was actually footage of shot by Thomas Edison's team in the early 1900s, and I'm sharing it because it's quite cool to see this footage from way back when. No sound again. But the path that the immigrants took coming off the boat, going up into the opening of Ellis Island, that's the same path that people take today. And this is kind of grainy. You can Google this. This belongs to the Library of Congress, so this is searchable online, just Ellis Island Immigrants, Thomas Edison. So immigrants, like they do today, if you're a visitor, they disembark from the ferry and they prepare to enter the building for inspection and processing. This is what we see today when we enter the museum. The passengers first entered the baggage room, and this is where they left everything that they owned. Imagine you come with a blanket wrapped with all of your possessions, and you are asked to leave them here in the baggage room. We'll get them to you later. Yet another terrifying experience along a very uncertain adventure and journey. Here is what you'll see today as a visitor when you come to the museum. I'm going to show you a quick video here, and just at the end, you'll note that, one more time. I'll stop and point out the stairs that are that lead up to the Great Hall. So this was full of people. If you've been there, you know the noise level and the echoing is pretty overwhelming. And here, these stairs that these visitors are heading up to, those are the stairs that the passengers would climb to and go through what is referred to as the 6-second physical. Doctors were watching the passengers, and if the doctors noticed someone who was out of breath or limping, that person was marked for further inspection. And I find it odd that these people who had just survived weeks at sea, and here they were, their health was being judged by how they walked up 20 stairs. So as they reach the top of the stairs, they come upon the Great Hall. And as many rangers will point out to me, for most of these people, this was probably the largest room they had ever seen. And again, they're on this journey, not certain what will happen. There is, of course, the chance that they will be sent back home. And so they're in this room. It's loud, it's echoey. I assume they don't smell too great because they had just been on a boat. Many, many languages. The gentleman earlier who was talking about being a World War II history buff can attest to the following, that many of these people had a great fear of people of authority in uniform. And here they were with uniformed inspectors and the like, telling them what to do and where to go, and just increasing the fear of what they were going through. And they've made this far journey, left their home, their family, spent any money they had, and just hoping that they're going to make it through and start their life here in the new world. Nearly every day for 20 years, people came through this space. It was often about, for the most part, 5,000 people were processed per day. And on April 17th, 1907, that was the busiest day. And that was when 11,000 people came through. So here is what you see when you come up to the Great Hall. Again, imagine you've left your home, the only place you've ever known, a small village, weeks on a ship, and you enter this massive room. It really is, it must have been incredibly, incredibly daunting. Everyone was put through a medical exam. Actually, as I mentioned before, that exam began earlier with the 6-second look from the doctors. And this right here is an image of someone being tested for trachoma, a very contagious eye disease that led to blindness. Inspectors used a button hook, something that was normally used to button up one's shoes, to fold back the person's upper eyelid. This trachoma, along with TB, were two of the most common medical reasons for being denied entry into the US. The concern being that the immigrant would become a ward of the state if they couldn't work due to blindness or other serious health issues. They couldn't contribute and would, as I said, be a ward of the state. Here we see passengers being questioned by inspectors. This is at one end of the Great Hall, which you saw in the last photos. And this process is similar to today's customs process that we go through when we're traveling internationally. Inspectors would ask questions related to the ship manifest. There were interpreters there for people who didn't speak English, which was a great number of those who came through. Questions on the manifests along the lines of, what's your name? Who are you accompanied by? What is your age, your nationality? What is your final destination? Among one of the key myths about Ellis Island is that the names were changed there. In fact, this did not happen. Inspectors weren't even writing people's names on these documents. These manifests were generated at the port of departure. So if there are any errors, those errors happened at where the passenger originated. Most names changes took place when people settled here in the US and wanted to, quote unquote, Americanize their names. After inspection, you made your way to what is referred to as the stairs of separation. There were 3 stairways. If you descended on the left side of the stairs, you were headed to New York City or New England. Excuse me. The right steps led you to the ticket office where you would prepare to travel to other parts of the country. And that right-hand staircase accounted for about 80% of the people. And I stand correct on that. That the 80% of the people who were at the island were processed in only 5 hours. But the remaining ones, those who went down the middle staircase, you were among the 20% of passengers who were detained. Of the 12 million people who came through Ellis Island, only 2% were denied entry. Reasons for detainment, or as I mentioned before, denial, were medical or legal. The health issues we talked about before, or if the paperwork was not in order. Something to keep in mind, which led to why the numbers were relatively low, is it was up to the steamship company to essentially vet people before they departed their homeland, because, and they were inspired to make this, to be fully sure that the people would get through, because the steamships were required to pay for people's cost of being detained at Ellis, and as well as if the people were deported or not allowed entry, steamship companies had to provide the sail back to the port of departure at their own cost. So it was in their financial best interest to vet the people before they boarded in their homeland. For the detainees, there were places for dorms for them to sleep in. There was life at Ellis Island. There was a school. There was a cafeteria. There's a replica of the dorms up on the 3rd floor of the museum. When the facility was built, the authorities actually miscalculated the number of immigrants who would be coming through. And as such, the original building expansion began almost immediately. Holidays were celebrated on Ellis Island, and I mentioned earlier that there were interpreters, and every ethnic group had an aid organization office on Ellis Island to assist the newcomers. And next, I want to point out that these experiences of the immigrant are featured in exhibits on the second floor. Through America's Gate, that exhibit area follows the process, the questioning, the medical inspections, detention. There's an example of a hearing room for those who were detained or in fear of being deported, and what that setup looked like. The peak immigration years area explores the massive wave of immigrants from 1890 through 1924, again, talking about why people left their homes, how they adapted to their new lives in the US. And this exhibit area also documents how attitudes changed towards immigration and how those attitudes led to new laws and processing procedures. You also read about Ellis Island firsthand experiences from some immigrants and what they expected and then what they found. One person quoted as saying, "I was told the streets were paved with gold. That wasn't true. Most streets weren't paved at all, and I was expected to pave them." Yeah, everything old is new again. Okay, I'm going to bring us back up to the third floor here. And this is one of the most popular exhibits. It's called Treasures from Home. When the museum was being created in the 1980s, there was a call to Ellis Island immigrants and their descendants to share items that families had brought from the homeland. So this is not the best video because I shot it on my phone. Lots of glare and such. Photos of immigrants and some of the memorabilia they brought with them, cameras, religious tokens, housewares. And as I mentioned, these were all donated. And the park has even, the National Park Service has even more artifacts, but this is what's featured now in the museum. Did I do this one already? I did, yeah. Here are some traditional clothing. I mentioned before the Augustus Sherman photos. These are the types of traditional garb that people would have worn for those photos that he took. And then, not a video, but lastly, this little guy here, this little teddy bear. He is a fan favorite, and it's America. Replicas are sold in the gift shop, as you can imagine. So now we will talk about the immigrant experience and the oral and how it's captured in the Oral History Project. It really is an amazing initiative that was started in the 1970s by the National Park Service. And it was interviews of immigrants themselves, the passengers, officials who worked on the island, people who were detained, and it's over 2,000 interviews took place, and there are written and some audio transcripts that you can find on the Foundation's website if you want to check that out. About a third of all Americans can trace an ancestor through the Port of New York. And again, referring back to the Steve Briganti video at the beginning, in 2001, our foundation unveiled the Ellis Island database. And at that point, we made these immigration arrival records free to the public online for the very first time. Prior to that, one would have to go to the National Archives and look on microfiche to do your family search and find the documents showing when your family arrived here in the US. You can access this database online for free. On our website, we provide video tutorials, some downloadable tip sheets. And if you're a member of the foundation at a certain level, even research experts from our Family History Center can conduct research on your behalf. Here we have the departure record for Craig's great-grandfather, who left present-day Lithuania when it was under Russian Empire control. This document is not from our database. You may notice that the form is actually in German. our researchers discovered this particular document using other genealogy resources. Remember earlier when I had explained that the original Ellis Island building burned down, and along with it, immigration records. Well, that included Craig's grandfather's manifest, we believe. This departure record, nonetheless, still provides a lot of information for piecing together your family history. We see here, I'm going to not do well with the name, but Kishmir, I'm not even going to bother with the last name. He was born in 1870 and departed Hamburg on the 18th of April in 1888. Given that time, he would have come, Ellis wasn't open yet, so he would have arrived at Castle Garden. According to the records, the voyage took between 10 and 12 days. He is noted, his occupation is he is a worker, and it gives the name of the ship he was on, Polaria, and the part of Russia where he had originally lived. As for the documents that burned when the original building went down, our database instead has custom records for that research. And while Kasimir's information should be available from that custom records document, for some reason, it is not among the records digitized for our database. Unfortunately, this is not completely unique. There were some 12 million people who were processed through Ellis Island and Castle Garden, and some of those records along the way were lost. But if you have family that maybe came through Ellis, you can certainly go to our database online and do some search. And as I said, if you're a member of the foundation at certain levels, you're able to get have our experts do the research for you. And it really is an amazing experience to find this data. And if you actually go to Ellis Island and visit the History Center in the museum, there's a nominal fee to sit down at a research station and look for your family. And my colleagues who work there say at least one person a day cries because they've made the connection between their grandparents or their father or coming through, and they are now walking in the steps of their family. And here they are finding the documentation, and it's just a piece along someone's genealogical journey, but it really is quite monumental in the family's experience. So that concludes my presentation, and I will do my best to answer questions. If I can't, I'll speak with my colleagues and with the National Park Service and get back to you with what I learned. And I hope you all enjoyed what I had to say. And I also hope that you will all consider supporting the foundation and our mission. Okay, I see people with their hands raised.
Okay.
This is new to me, so I don't know how to deal with that.
Suzanne, while we're picking those folks, let me just briefly tell you that several years ago, the Summit Old Guard sponsored a trip to the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, and it was magical. And I suspect because of your great presentation today that we'll be going back very soon.
I hope so. I will tell you, the islands both closed for a relatively short period of time during COVID. And the numbers are ticking back up, I'm happy to say, and we really do expect by next summer that will be at pre-COVID numbers. If you want to visit during the week is the best time. Wednesday is actually the quietest time, I'm told, because that's when many out-of-towners are seeing a matinee. So Wednesday is a great time to come. There's a There's the ferries leave Liberty State Park. You can go to the Statue City Cruises website, or from our website, you can link to it to learn about the ferry times and how to get to the departure dock.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you. And now for the questions.
Okay, we have questions online first. Bill Freund, you have to unmute.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have a question. The story has it that family names were frequently changed by the immigration officer on Ellis Island.
Nope.
They say that if the family was a Tomaszewski, the officer heard Thomas, that became the family name.
Yeah.
Ever after. The others deny this happened because the immigration officers had, they had the ship manifest, as you showed, with the names listed correctly. So the families themselves must have changed their names. Which is the truth?
The families themselves changed their names, or what may have happened as well. The inspectors on Ellis Island did not change the names. They did not cross out the SKI or whatever it was to Americanize it. Errors may have taken place in the port of departure. Now, when I heard some oral histories where the person would say, I was asked how to spell my name and I didn't know how to spell my name. So the person in Hamburg just wrote it phonetically, and that's what ended up on the manifest. But I think from what historians have told me, for the most part, it was people who came here and Americanized their name. They wanted to fit in. They didn't want to be seen like the other. So no names changed. That's a myth. We hear it all the time, all the time. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, Ron Wagner.
I have two questions. One, in one of the exhibits, it mentioned something about if an immigrant had a job in the United States before coming over, they were not allowed in. There was some kind of restriction on that. And my second question is, what kind of documents did the immigrants actually have? I mean, did they have passports like you have today, or what was there?
No, my understanding, and this is one of the questions, two of the questions actually, I want to get clarification on from the Park Service, and I'll follow up with that. Until then, I'll share what my understanding is, and I know it goes deeper. That they wanted the immigrants to be capable of working, but they did not want them to be, I believe they called them contract workers before they came. And again, my understanding is twofold. One, there were people who would swindle them and say, oh, I've got a job for you if you come here, and that wasn't the case. And then secondly, there was a process in which they wanted people to be able to get a job when they were here, or people who already lived here. And of course, there were migrants who came, worked for a few years, went home. That of course was the case. And then as for documents, my understanding, there were no passports for many, many years. It was up in 1924 when that immigrant law changed and the quota system began. And that's when people coming here would go to the embassy to get a visa. So that's when that paperwork component changed. But I have never asked specifically about passports and what kind of documentation people had beyond their ticket. I'm going to do that, and I will report back to you all.
Okay, Mitch Erickson.
Thank you, Suzanne, for a wonderful presentation. Personal opinion, Ellis Island is one of the jewels of all of the national park system. So thumbs up. You can see the spelling of my name on the face tile. There are a lot of ways to spell Erickson, and I worked with somebody who spelled it A-I-R-E-X-O-N. Who knew? My question is, what's the budget for the monument, and how's it broken down?
Oh, that's a National Park Service question, because our foundation, when we raise money for these projects, and when the project is done, for example, in 2019, we worked on the Statue of Liberty Museum. That was a $100 million campaign. And we worked on that from groundbreaking through to May 16th when it opened to the public, and we essentially hand the keys to the Park Service and they take it from there. So what it costs the Department of Interior to manage the two buildings, I don't know. I'm sure it's available because it's public documents, but I wouldn't even begin to know where to find that out.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, I had a tour of the other end of Ellis Island. It is very, very cool. So if we ever come out there, I'm going to make a big pitch for us all getting hard hats and going.
Yeah, for sure. And you have to do that ahead of time. There's actually a different foundation called Save Ellis Island. They manage that, and the numbers that they keep on the tours are relatively small. So for sure, book that in advance. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Speak here, then guys in the room hear me better too. So thank you, and great talk, and more people will talk about that. But here's my question. There's a lot of talk about immigration in the United States these days. I mean, it's like one of the biggest issues for several years now. And there are a lot of people who are pretty much anti-immigration, and a lot of people who I think probably still believe that immigration is good for the United States. And so, I try to think back how was it when Ellis Island all these people were coming through Ellis Island? Was the US similar in those days? Was it split between people who welcomed immigrants and people who didn't want them? And also, what was the experience of people then, the immigrants? You talked a little bit about their individual experiences. How would you say that compares to, on average, how we're treating immigrants today?
I mentioned at some point so the original museum were the peak years of Ellis Island, and the immigrant experience is covered in there. And then we expanded it to talk about pre and post Ellis. And the documents there show the consistencies in terms of the negative feeling of some residents here, not just because people were coming in, but because they looked different. And you see the propaganda from 150 years ago, and you could insert the name of a different country, and it's so similar. The arguments, they will take our jobs, they don't know the language. So the other is just a constant throughout our history, and it's documented here at the museum. And just a little heads up, next year we'll be announcing a refurbishment, I'm not sure what the right word would be, of the Ellis Island Museum experience, because one, it's from 1990, but we originally were the Ellis Island Immigration Museum. It has since been renamed the Ellis Island National Museum of Immigration. So we want to tell the broader story, more specifics to that, to tell all of the immigration experience here in the US. So as I said, the propaganda, the newspapers, the consistency is striking, where they, and just even, I'm sure you all are aware, I'm of Irish descent. The Irish were considered the other for a good period of time, and then they became okay, and then it was the Southern Europeans. So it's everything old, unfortunately, is new again. And that is depicted in the museum, and will be even more so as we make the changes. But that's pretty consistent with what was experienced, and also why the quota system went into place. When you look at from a calendar standpoint, so it's the early 1900s, the Gilded Age, the Depression hasn't come here yet. We're building, and then not as many workers were needed because so many people had come here. So they slammed the door shut. And the rules that were put into place in 1924 with the quota system, that was not changed until the 1960s. Johnson changed that, but for 40 years, this quota system was in place. And that was all through the Depression, World War II, and people stopped traveling or immigrating for different reasons. But much of it remains the same and similar, unfortunately. And history has proven that, yeah.
So, Suzanne, I had once read that the British steamship companies, including Cunard, typically had their first port of call in Boston, followed by New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then some of the southern cities such as Savannah, and that it was cheaper to get off in Boston than New York. And that could help you understand how immigrants went to many of those cities initially. Any truth to that story?
I'm writing it down to my things I want to learn about, and we'll get back to you guys. I don't know that. I'm gonna find out. I'll let you know.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's one of the things I love about this job is learning something new every day. And as I mentioned, I think it was just yesterday, I was bringing out some people to the island, and we sat through a film that I hadn't seen in a while. And one of the park rangers who was introducing it, she's the one who taught me about 1808, 1808, where we're no longer able to bring in people who are going to be enslaved. I didn't know that was one of the factors that led to the federal government taking it over. So you all have given me 3 questions for something new I can learn. I like it.
Rick Smith?
Jim Blaine?
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. Fascinating discussion and presentation. I'll have to plan a return trip. It's probably been over 20 years since I've been to Ellis Island. Just a quick question. Have you noticed or any anecdotal evidence that the new websites like Ancestry.com have increased interest in Ellis Island, or maybe visitations to Ellis Island, or maybe it's a vice versa situation? You might be
I will say it's yes, just in general, when the Ellis Island database was launched in 2001 by the foundation, we worked in concert with Family Search, which is the Latter-day Saints. And this was the first time that these records were available, as I said, outside the National Archives, let alone online. So the server crashed. We had to keep adding servers. That was one of the jobs I consulted on, and it was mayhem, and it was beautiful. It was great. But from there, Ancestry came, and these other, which obviously ultimately led to 23andMe and all these other different modes of doing it. But certainly the interest in genealogy, I'm told it's one of the most popular hobbies in the world, and I believe I'll take credit. We started it. We started the average Joe. But I think people being able to really dig with Ancestry gets them to come where they are here. And then I've spoken with people abroad who they often host, tourism people who they often have travelers who are just following their family's journey. I'm actually about to do a project with a reporter who's worked for New York One for years and years, and she's about to follow in her grandfather's footsteps through Italy to Naples, and then making her way here. So we're starting that tomorrow, and that'll be really cool. So I think they feed off each other, but I'm going to give us credit for getting the ball rolling.
Well, you deserve the credit, certainly. Thank you, Suzanne.
Jim Blaine? My question is, I had a friend at Bell Labs who, back when they were replacing the copper, he was called in to consult on doing that, and I wondered if you had any other information about that.
And you mean in the 1980s, right, when we were doing the restoration?
Right.
So I don't, but as you're saying that, I'm thinking back, I have this, basically it's the Restoration Bible kind of thing. And it talks about the different companies that were involved because of the different expertise that they could bring in. I'll pull together some of that too, and I'll share that with you guys. I have a scanned version of that I can share with you. You can see the different organizations that were involved. And still to this day, when we built the Statue of Liberty Museum, there are people who are second, third generation whose families worked on the 1980s restoration. So there's this beautiful connection of people who have this familiar connection to it, not just through immigration, but as Americans themselves being part of keeping these monuments alive and available for future generations. But I'm going to find that document with the list of organizations, and I'm adding that to my list.
Okay, the last question, because of time, Bill Hagman.
Hi, Suzanne. Thank you for the presentation. Ellis Island and Liberty Island are at low elevations. What's being done about potential sea level rise?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That was actually when the new museum was designed, and I keep referring back to it because that was the last huge project that was undertaken, and actually it had been decades since a new structure was actually built on Liberty Island. So prior to the new Statue of Liberty Museum being built, there was housing on Liberty Island, and the superintendent lived there, some park rangers lived there, and then Sandy hit and wiped those, I'm sorry, there's a little bug in my house, and wiped out those buildings. So the benefit to that was that we have a space now to put our museum, but we saw the devastation that Mother Nature can cause. So the museum itself, actually, when the statue is on the highest peak of Liberty Island, which isn't really that high, but the water never even got up to the fort. But the museum itself was built for a 500-year flood. So that's over on Liberty Island. On Ellis Island, as we speak, the National Park Service is in the midst of rebuilding the entire seawall around both the whole 2 islands of Ellis that I showed you in that image. So things along those lines. When Sandy hit, Ellis Island was closed for a couple of years because it got slammed. Everything in the basement, which is where all the equipment was, AV, blah, 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 all destroyed. So that had to be moved. So those are that type of change has been done to keep things healthy for the next time. But then the seawall, but it will happen, unfortunately, and they're taking the steps that they can for things that are new and to reinforce what's already there as it happens.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Suzanne,
Yes.
I would like to thank you for your presentation, your wonderful presentation today. And on behalf of the Summit Old Guard, I'd like to present you with a certificate of appreciation from the Old Guard.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.
A little background. The Summit Old Guard was established in 1930, and around 1900s, the beginning of the 1900s, Summit was really the largest producer and distributor of orchids in the United States. And for that reason, the Old Guard had selected the orchid to be on their certificates of appreciation and letterhead, wherever logo is used. So thank you very much. One other way that the Summit Old Guard shows its appreciation is the Old Guard salute. Thank you very much.
I thank you. And I'll get back to you all with the information I learned. And please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me via email if you have additional questions. I am always happy to spread the word. And I do hope you all will come out soon.